Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to episode 2 of Making of the Fuel Speedways. So, today we're going to dive into not just episode 2 but into this idea of world building. So, in the first episode, I told you guys that I didn't even put a race in there because I wanted to do some world building to actually establish the tone of the series. And this is a very important element because the races are basically what the crime is to a cop show, which is that it's the thing that you could guarantee to see every week. Everything else is what can be changed. Everything else is what's to the side and is interesting and is the stuff that's dynamic. But the crime must always be there because that's what you guaranteed every single week. And that's the same with this series. It's the race that you're guaranteed to find every single week. So then why is it that the first 2 episodes are actually devoid of races? Here's why. I needed to establish some world building, which is very strange considering that this is not fantasy, but I treated it as fantasy because of the almost fantastical elements that are in it, the elements that couldn't exist in the real world but exist anyway, in terms of just the mythology of this series, the one-on-one racing, so to speak, the fact that there are crowns, there are barons, there are rivalries. It's a sports opera. It's a fantasy but set in a real world motorsports world. So I needed to establish some world building, and that included establishing what kind of place we're entering into, as per the first episode, where it was established that this is a high school playground for adults. The second episode is to establish the types of races that they are. And in this episode 2, I decided to establish the drag race, because drag racing in Formula 1 cars is also a weird conception. It's not really done. The closest you'll come to is actually drag cars that look like Formula 1 cars but actually aren't Formula 1 cars. So in Diamond in the Rough, the second episode, I reintroduced a character who's pretty much a main character in the Ignited trilogy. She isn't the main character, that's Max Mackay, but she is a very important secondary character who is the plot pretty much surrounds her in the first book, and she shows up in the second and third installments as well. But I felt that I wanted to use her in the series. She'd be the only character who comes straight from the trilogy into the series, because I wanted her youth to almost be a gateway for young readers to enter this series. She's 19 years old when Stories of the Fuel Speedway begins. She's about 15, 16 in the trilogy, 17. She grows up from basically 15 all the way through until she's 18. But here she is a 19-year-old woman. She is both an adult, but at the same time she is technically a teenager. And that was important because that's the gateway. She's also a girl, a woman, so I also wanted that to be a gateway for females who are reading this to be like, oh hey, look at that. She's basically the epitome of Tolkien. She's also a young colored woman, but who has a dark skin tone like black people. So that also gives another gateway to black people and also colored people as well to actually engage with this without feeling that it's a completely different world. And Darcy Stevens, her full name, she goes by Stevie. She starts off the episode running towards the place. She's running because she's late, and we think that she's in a car. The way I emphasize the speed with which she's going, only to find out that she's actually running on foot. And she meets up with Glenn Jacobs, who, as you might know, was established in book 2. Actually, you wouldn't know because I haven't actually finished it as per the making of this episode, but he is established as a main character in Full Talk, and here he is as Mood Swing's business partner, which is another important point. Mood Swing created the idea of Formula X, but everyone knows that it's Glenn who keeps the show together. He's the glue that holds it all together, and it was important to establish him as well. And one of the defining things that I established is that he calls the shots and basically establishes what you're about to see. So he will basically tell you what it is that's going to happen in this episode. Not in every episode, of course, because that would be boring, but you can almost feel comfortable that when if you want to know what's going to happen, wait for Glenn to say it, and then now you know what's going to happen. Of course, this doesn't actually stop this, the episode from being surprising, because just because he establishes what race you're going to see doesn't mean you'll know who wins. In fact, speaking of that, we only find out from who won the previous episode in this episode, as we find out that race we saw between Solo and Brenda. Oh, look, Solo won the episode, so he has gone one step further in the Royal Tourney, which again is name dropped because I needed to establish that this is a critical part of the coming weeks. You can almost say it's the first arc, but it isn't really. But I want to say that it is, because it's something that you establish in the previous episode. You can follow the tidbits of it in this episode, and with the promise that something more is going to be established in the next episode. But I mean, that's the nature of tournaments. You start off with 8 teams or people, and you will end up with 1. I also established that this is all heading towards something, which is a pay-per-view. Here we come all the way back to that professional wrestling element. And this, while like I said before, I downplayed it in the trilogy because I needed to make that more a novel and less, this playground I can play around with to do whatever I felt like. I needed to turn it into a novel that people actually feel comfortable, reading something that's familiar to them. Here, I didn't play by those rules. Here, I established early on that it was about professional wrestling, which is why this idea that every episode within the month is heading towards a pay-per-view, a special event, an event that does not take place in the Fuel Speedway, but takes place outside of the Fuel Speedway, in various places around the city. I established it here in the first few episodes to show that every sort of storyline hits some sort of peak, whether it's a mini peak or a major peak, it doesn't really matter, but it hits some sort of peak because I wanted the audience to feel like this is all heading towards something. And because I knew that this is a soap opera, or it's a sports opera specifically, that it just keeps going, at least until the end of the season. It's just going to keep going like a classic soapy. But I needed, because I know that people prefer beginnings and middles and ends, I knew that I needed to have these almost chapter endings, which is what the pay-per-views are. I mean, I call them pay-per-views because in the story they linked to that pay-per-view formula. It would be something like in the story, it would be something that would pop up. It would be a pop-up channel. Mutsung would buy a pop-up channel on DSTV, and then at that specific time, like in real time, on that Sunday, it would play on that DSTV pop-up channel, and the channel would pop back down afterwards. That's basically how pay-per-view works. If you didn't know, in America, that's how it works. That you pay for a pay-per-view, then when it's time to watch that pay-per-view, you watch it as it happens, and then when that pay-per-view is over, bloop, comes off. And that's what, in the universe, that's what happens. That's what Mood Swing has set up to happen in the universe. Of course, in real life, what the pay-per-view is only a means of ending one chapter so you can begin another. And I specifically mentioned chapters because it's like a chapter in a book. That the story doesn't end there. There will be another chapter to come right after that chapter, and that's the idea. That's the point. That it ends one chapter, but it also functions as the beginning of another chapter. So in this episode, we introduced to Stevie, we introduced to a new race type called drag racing, and we're also introduced to nicknames. Now, nicknames become important because I realized early on, even in the trilogy, that people refer to each other by nicknames, especially when you're young. It's something that's easy to remember. It doesn't sound like everyone else's name. It doesn't sound ordinary or boring. It puts a peak on something. It puts an element of importance on someone. Or even if it's you trying to ridicule the guy or trying to make it light or something, it's memorable is the point I'm trying to make. And I introduce nicknames here. I call them tags. And that's important because it becomes immediately easier to recognize someone as soon as you know their tag. I already introduced the idea of naming the vehicles, so we know that that's in place. But now I introduced this idea of naming the people, something specific, something that will be memorable. Even if you won't remember who Stevie is, you'll definitely remember who the Diamond in the Rough is after this episode.